From the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., and a warm welcome to today's webinar on conflict in Afghanistan, a new regional security map and state-building implications since the Taliban takeover. My name is Benjamin Petrini. I'm a research fellow in the Conflict, Security and Development Program here at IISS. Our program monitors armed conflict globally and analyzes the implications on countries' development and peace trajectories and on international security. The team curates the IISS yearly flagship publication on armed conflict survey, which is a compendium of all main conflicts globally. Today's session is part of our conflict briefings webinar series, and in the recent past we have had briefings on Mozambique, Syria, the Central African Republic, Colombia, and the Lake Chad Basin. We convene one of these every 2 months. Afghanistan has been an obvious country of interest for the Institute, not only from the point of view of monitoring the armed conflict, but also for the place that it had for US and Western foreign policy and for geopolitical issues in the last 2 decades. However, I should mention also that the IISS works closely on the region, not only from an analytical point of view, also in actively engaging with policymakers and facilitating dialogues. This webinar, we have all watched in shock the chaotic and tragic pullout of US coalition troops and Afghan personnel from Kabul last summer as the Taliban took power and the Afghan government and national army collapsed. So today, almost a year has passed and we have a chance to sort of take stock of the situation. And there have been many developments since, and there are several dimensions to be explored. And obviously we cannot do justice to all of them in just 1.5 hours. There is, however, one dimension that I want to single out right from the start, which is the humanitarian catastrophe, which is the most pressing one. The UN estimates that 93% of people today are food insecure in Afghanistan. And this is a crisis that it is exacerbated by the worst drought that Afghanistan has experienced in 3 decades, and the second one in the last 4 years. Obviously, the freezing of Afghan assets by the US and the EU has exacerbated further this crisis, the pullout of most of the international engagement on aid and development, as well as now also the rising food prices. So I think that our conversation, although it would not cover these issues, should be framed and around the humanitarian crisis, and this should be center stage for policymakers. There are 2 dimensions that I think will be very interesting and important to uncover. The first one is around the legacy of state building. The US and its allies spent 2 decades in the country, not only fighting a war continuously, but also together with multilateral institutions, they've had the aspiration to turn the country around in terms of providing goods and services for its people, for implementing economic development, implementing market-based reforms, and strengthening the capacity of its institutions and security sector. Most of this international engagement came to an end last August. But there is a chance, I think we need to discuss to what extent there has been some continuity or some rupture, and how what is the legacy from this previous period into Afghanistan now going forward. For a conflict and peace analyst like myself, one of the most unnerving aspects of the US pullout was how quickly the melting of the Afghan government and its security apparatus took place. This proves in one way the vacuity of two decades of state building. So we want to explore, I think, some of these dimensions. The second one is the regional security landscape. The Taliban return to power changes the geopolitical landscape and the strategic calculus for the South Asia's regional state actors and for Afghan neighbors, and also the sort of the geopolitical landscape in the wider region. We have 5 excellent speakers today who will discuss these issues, and I have the pleasure to welcome, in order of appearance, Kate Bateman, who's a senior expert on Afghanistan at the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, here in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Kate. Dr. Dawood Azami, an associate fellow for South Asia with us at the Institute, and a multimedia editor at the BBC World Service in London. John Raine, who's a senior advisor for geopolitical due diligence with the Institute with IISS. We have also Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, a senior research fellow at the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI. And we have Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, a senior fellow for South Asia here at IISS. So welcome to all of you. Before we start, just some quick logistics and housekeeping rules. This webinar will last for 1.5 hours. We have 2 different rounds of remarks by the speakers, and we will then open it up to questions from the audience. To ask your question, you can type your question or comment in the Q&A box on your screen, and I will relate the question for you. I'll turn to Kate and briefly introduce her before asking her question, and I will do the same with the senior expert on Afghanistan at USIP. Kate Bateman has a wealth of experience on Afghanistan. She worked previously at the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, where she led reports on anti-corruption, counter-narcotics, reintegration of ex-combatants, and gender equality. She also worked at the Center for a New American Security and has also served in intelligence and policy positions at the State Department in Washington, D.C., Afghanistan. Kate, on the first theme that I mentioned on state building, can you set the stage for us on the historical trajectory of state building in Afghanistan post-2001, and where has the focus been in terms of governance, security, and thank you.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon. Thanks, Benjamin, for the kind introduction, and it's great to be here with my fellow panelists. I think first, as you said, we have to recognize that the state building effort, as we knew it, ended when the Taliban won the war. And I'll come back to that. I think the state building effort is inseparable from our discussion of the war itself and the conduct of the war. But I think it's important to consider what Afghans with international support had achieved as of last summer before the Taliban takeover. And the short answer is that state building efforts were filled with many mistakes and failures, and some challenges that were, perhaps insurmountable. We can go into those at greater depth, but they were not. State building was not a complete failure. Again, taking August pre-Taliban takeover as our point of analysis. But if we look at 2001 as the baseline, Afghanistan saw some really remarkable development progress over 2 decades. It went from being at the bottom on human development indicators, where it was an outlier among the poorest countries, to being on par with other countries at its income level. And what that meant in human terms was life expectancy rose from 56 to 65. We saw literacy gains, especially for youth, for males and females. Women got access to better maternal health care that saved thousands of lives. We saw a reduction in the deaths from pregnancy and childbirth related causes of anywhere from 20 to 50%. The greatest gains really appeared to have been in education and healthcare in terms of social development. But other areas of significant progress were in the media sector. Afghanistan developed a burgeoning independent media, and as well as many civil society organizations that were taking on increasing roles in holding government accountable and so on. And also, of course, a huge gain was women's access to jobs, to services, education, healthcare, and reclaiming their roles in the public sphere. I think it's hard to overstate the changes that we're seeing from over those 20 years for women and girls. Although that progress was certainly uneven. And I think it's very important to remember there were some stark urban and rural divides in those gains, and that's been that's been a critique of the state building effort, that we have this urban rural unevenness, that urban areas saw many more of the gains. However, it's also worth noting that is often how development occurs. It begins in the population centers, of course, and moves out to periphery. In terms of institution building at the center, one of the bright spots was the public financial management system. Not perfect, of course, but it got early and consistent attention and resources from the donors, and that helped improve. Set up a stable, somewhat independent central bank Ministry of Finance. At the local level, we had the very successful National Solidarity Program, which then later became Citizens Charter, and that supported 9,000 elected community development councils around the country, and half of those members were women. So yes, the progress was very uneven, but it should not be dismissed. And I think it's too easy to kind of paint a broad brush and say that the whole state building effort had failed even before the Taliban takeover. However, I say, all of this is now, we now know how fragile all of those gains were, even more than we anticipated, and sustaining much of them depended on containing the Taliban insurgency, if not defeating it. So again, we can't separate the state building effort from the war itself. And there's this paradoxical relationship between state building in Afghanistan and the war, because on the one hand, as we saw as of last August, state building could take place because of the US and NATO security umbrella and the support that we were providing that held the Taliban at bay. On the other hand, for 20 years, state building itself was constantly subordinated to, and I would argue undermined by, the war. For the US, our counterterrorism and security goals were number one. So when short-term CT or security goals came in conflict with our longer-term state building and governance goals, counterterrorism trumped. And the overall effect was that we were never primarily focused on the state building. And that brings us to Biden's withdrawal decision. Most predictions were that the Afghan Republic would eventually fall to the Taliban. Of course, no one predicted that fast, and probably including the Taliban. But the decision to withdraw was therefore a policy decision that the US was willing to accept the risk of a Taliban takeover. And I'd say the inverse of that is that the withdrawal decision also meant the US was willing to accept the end of its state building project in Afghanistan and tolerate whatever might come next. And I want to just briefly mention just because all of this hinged so much on the performance and the viability of the Afghan security forces, I think it's it's important to note, what their collapse indicated about, the 20-year effort. And there are numerous reasons for the fast collapse of security forces. We can point to corruption as a factor and having hollowed out, institutions and diverted, critical supplies, ammunition, medicine, and so on. We can point to poor leadership, but it's also important to remember the Taliban had been ascendant on the battlefield for years. And if 100,000 US troops, 150,000 US and NATO troops could not defeat the insurgency in 2011, 2012, I think it was folly to expect that the Afghan security forces could do the same. And finally, just mention the contractor support. John Schroden, the scholar Jonathan Schroden, has written very articulately, eloquently about the factors that contributed to the collapse, and we'll understand more over time. But the withdrawal of our contractor support meant essentially crippled the Afghan Air Force from providing close air support on the battlefield and from providing medevac and maintaining supply lines. And as the Taliban quickly swept over the country last spring and summer and took increasingly more districts, you had this domino effect of the morale was seriously eroded. The US was on its way out, and I think security forces, in some cases, did not even. It was either go into a suicide mission, a pitched battle against Taliban forces, or retreat and negotiate a surrender or retreat. And many of them made a logical choice now to try to survive. So I will stop there and look forward to other panelists' comments.
Thanks so much, Kate. I think you added a lot of needed nuance to the gains that state building has achieved in the last of human development, social. And also, I think the questions that are still lingering with us are how fragile those gains are, and we can go into that because that speaks to some work that we do here at the Institute on the complex relationship between a war and building a peace. And are there contradictions between those? Can they go in parallel? And so I think it's an interesting area to explore further. Turn to Dr. Dawood Azami, who is said earlier an associate fellow for South Asia with us at the Institute. He's an award-winning senior broadcast journalist and academic. As a multimedia editor in the BBC World Service in London, he leads as a journalist in covering international news and current affairs. He has also taught as a visiting lecturer at the University of Westminster and the Ohio State University, and has written extensively on security and political issues in South and Central Asia. So Dawood, in terms of the regional political and security landscape, how state actors in the region reacted to the Taliban's takeover, and what have been their responses and Afghan policy in this first year? I mean, we know that no country has formally recognized Afghanistan, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan on today. Dawood, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your kind introduction. And it's great to be in the company of great scholars and observers and experts of Afghanistan and the region. To answer your question, most neighbors and regional countries received the news of the Taliban takeover calmly. There were no alarm bells in most regional capitals. Most of these countries had already links with the Afghan Taliban. And it became obvious over the past few years that Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan were against the long-term NATO presence in Afghanistan. So therefore, many regional countries were relieved in many ways to see the US and NATO forces leave Afghanistan. And just to give you a bit of background, after signing the Doha deal in early 2020, the Taliban had been saying repeatedly that they didn't want to capture major cities. But in mid-2021, while the US was mainly focused on the withdrawal of its troops, the war in Afghanistan intensified. And on the 2nd of August, 2021, I tweeted that as opposed to their public statements, the Taliban seemed to be trying to capture provincial capitals before the completion of the US military withdrawal, which was scheduled to be completed by the end of August. So that was on the 2nd of August that I said that. My view was that the Taliban aimed to capture provincial capitals while the US forces were still present in Afghanistan, in order to imply that the US had been defeated militarily. And I also added that some regional players were also wanted the US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan to be recorded in history as a defeat. And 4 days later, on the 6th of August, Zaranj, the center of Nimroz province on the border with Iran, became the first provincial capital that was captured by the Taliban. And then within 10 days, the Taliban captured all the other cities, including the country's capital, Kabul. So both the Taliban and their regional allies achieved the goal of ending the US and NATO military presence in Afghanistan. Regardless of the chaotic withdrawal and humanitarian tragedy that you referred to earlier, that followed the withdrawal and still continues, unfortunately, the US military withdrawal seemed to be making sense in a different context when it comes to the ongoing war in Ukraine. In an article in 2018, I wrote that by establishing links with the Afghan Taliban, Russia wanted to pressurize and even undermine the US and NATO in Afghanistan. So the US withdrawal from Afghanistan means that the West can afford to focus on the war in Ukraine. And in the meantime, Russia lost the option to increase pressure on the US and NATO elsewhere, i.e. in Afghanistan. So now, when it comes to regional countries' expectations from the Taliban government, they can be divided into 3 categories. The most important issue for all regional countries is security and counterterrorism. They want the Taliban government to cut ties with transnational and international violent extremist groups, curb militancy, and prevent groups and individuals from using the Afghan territory to pose a threat to their national security. So countries have their preferences when it comes to activities of such groups. For example, for Pakistan, it is mainly the TTP or the Pakistani Taliban group. For China, it's mainly about ETIM. For Iran, Central Asian countries, and Russia, the main concern is ISKP or the Islamic State Khorasan province. For India, it is India-focused regional groups as well as Al-Qaeda. And when it comes to security challenges, internal security challenges for the Taliban, in the immediate and near future, the Taliban are most likely to face 3 types of armed opposition and resistance. The first comes from Islamic State Khorasan group. And by the way, it was the only ideological militant group and remains the only group that challenged the Taliban ideologically and militarily. And the 2 groups have been fighting each other since the emergence of ISIS in 2015. And I mean, the ISIS emerged in 2014, but ISKP was established in January 2015. The second challenge, second security challenge, faced by the Taliban is the resistance by political opponents. So small-scale skirmishes, such as the ones already seen in some provinces, including Baghlan and Panjshir. And the third is target assassinations and guerrilla attacks against the Taliban officials and fighters. And the intensity of such opposition depends on three factors. The first one is the resolve and resilience of the opposing side, whether it is ISKP or the political resistance. Second factor is the degree of external support for local resistance. If, for example, the resistance gets sanctuary and support and secure supply lines, and then it will be even a bigger challenge for the Taliban. But so far, there are no indications that resistance is getting proper sanctuary and proper support from outside Afghanistan, although some countries might be indicating to help them. And the third factor is the Taliban's policies and governance style and the degree of their tolerance and accommodation of the demands and aspirations of various segments of the Afghan society. So the intensity of armed opposition will depend on these three factors. And the second general concern that these regional countries have is about the nature of Taliban government. They want the new Afghan government to be inclusive and broad-based. So far, mostly the Taliban have been appointed as hiring officials, ministers, deputy ministers, provincial governors, security commanders, and all the other high-ranking officials mostly have been the members of the Taliban. And the third major concern they have is the Taliban's policies, and expect them to be moderate in their approach when it comes to human rights. And the structure and makeup of the Taliban government, as well as policies, will determine the future course of action in these regional capitals. And not addressing key concerns of various state actors monopolizing power and imposing more restrictions internally will make it more difficult for regional countries and the wider international community to recognize the Taliban government in Afghanistan. So I'll stop here. We can discuss some of these issues in the Q&A session. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Dawood. I think it's very informative that all state actors, even though they have different interpretations, they have these three issues as concern, as you said: the security, counterterrorism, the second one in the inclusivity of government, and the third one a moderate approach to human rights. And also we should underscore the extent to which these three issues, these three dimensions, are obviously interlinked, and one would depend on the other. They would not go in isolation. But thank you very much for that. I'll turn it now to John Raine, who is a senior advisor for geopolitical and due diligence here at the Institute, as I mentioned earlier. John joined the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1984, where he served for 33 years. His overseas postings include Kuwait, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Baghdad, and Islamabad. In addition to bilateral and multilateral diplomatic work, worked extensively with UK armed forces on deployed operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in the UK on strategy and future capabilities. Now, John, what's your take on the transition that Afghanistan has gone through from a regional security perspective, and how does the Taliban takeover move the geopolitical equilibrium in the South Asia region and in the Middle East, an equilibrium that obviously is different from the one in the late 90s when the Taliban first took power. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I'm going to pick up on points that Dawood made really well to try to answer that question. The first of those was the reaction was, as Dawood said, regionally and in the Middle East, surprisingly calm last August to such a seismic event. And it was as if the Taliban had returned, but they'd returned without the political weight that they had in the 1990s. And for many Middle Eastern countries, they looked like, at the best, a very uncertain prospect, certainly for partnership or for recognition. At worst, they looked like a liability. I generalize about the Middle East, but I will talk separately about Iran because considerations are different for Iran. But as their first reaction was one of kind of nervous uncertainty about what had happened, I think a number of things have happened in the last 9 to 10 months, which are beginning to crystallize the impact of the Taliban, certainly on the Middle East region. And the first of those is that the Middle East's own dynamics are developing very fast. Some of these are internally driven, some have been propelled by external opportunities and global events. But in summary, they're on a trajectory of rapprochement and economic and financial development at pace. You can throw in as well regulatory and social development. So the GCC has been set on driving down political tensions. We've seen that in extensive rapprochement, both in the immediate neighborhood, for example, with Turkey, but also more widely in South Asia and in the Mediterranean. So if you like, it's time for everyone to lower the tension and make some money. When it comes to the Taliban have no obvious contribution to make to that agenda as either a market or as yet as a development partner, or indeed as anything like a security partner. So their value there is low in the region. The second thing that has happened is really a hardening of the loosely defined authoritarian agenda. And one particular target there is, of course, militant Islam. And in that regard, the Taliban most definitely represents a liability, with the important exception that there is something even worse to the right of them, and Dawood mentioned that earlier, and that is ISIK, Islamic movement of Khorasan, is if anything even more deadly. But it's not yet at the point where, for Arab regimes who are opposed to militant Islam, are prepared to work with the Taliban. That's a long way off. So where has it left policy for the key Middle East countries? I think it has now boiled down to a very pragmatic level of engagement. There are residual agenda items which GCC states have to address. There are consular issues at some scale for those countries who host large numbers of Afghans or have their own consular concerns inside Afghanistan. There have been some commercial opportunities which they will be keen to pursue. And of course, in the case of Qatar has played a continuing role as a diplomatic intermediary. So there is still some diplomatic work to be done, possibly by the Gulf states. But this is a very, very reduced, almost minimal agenda. You have to set against that another major development in the Gulf, which is a growing concern about the hazards that the region faces in regulatory terms because of the very large number of sanctioned entities. So Iran has, I think, the single largest number of sanctioned entities for any jurisdiction. We have to add to that now sanctions affecting Russian money, which is in the Gulf. And of course, we've got the Taliban too. So it is a consideration for Gulf states that they are under scrutiny by critically US and the UN, for example, through the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, for the way in which they conduct and regulate their financial and economic activities. So in that kind of environment, getting any much closer to the Taliban represents a risk that you really ought to be avoiding. Now, I'll just say a quick word on Iran. It is different for Iran. There's an agenda here of unsettled issues relating to security in the case of the Hazara, if not to cultural identity. there is also, of course, the water diplomacy, which is an increasingly vexed area between the two countries. The initial reaction in Iran was a mixed one, because this was the displacement of the US from the region, which is, of course, an avowed objective of the Iranian regime. But I think it's become clear now, as tensions have risen again between Iran and Afghanistan, that the only thing that they do share is an enemy, and even in some cases that's just on paper. It's just, as it were, a shared technical enmity. The prospects for them having a working relationship, or one in which they could forge any kind of partnership, I think are very remote. There's both too much bad blood for cultural and sectarial reasons, and there's just not a sufficient coincidence of interests. And we've seen, sadly, instances of violence on the border and inside Afghanistan and Iran. So I think even Iran now is finding Taliban difficult going. There's one final dynamic which, as far as the Middle East is concerned, the Taliban are relevant to, and that's certainly the Gulf Partnership and investment in economic development of what we could broadly call the CPEC plus. And there is definitely an interest, the length of the Gulf, and what opportunities there might be there, particularly for investment. That's part of the pivot to the east of the key players, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The settling of Afghanistan, the inclusion of Afghanistan would of course be a wonderful thing for that. Put another way, if the Taliban represent a liability to that, that will be factored in, I think, to the levels of commitment that the Gulf are prepared to show to that region, to, as it were, the Northern Gulf. But in summary, so much else is going on in the Middle East that the Taliban has slid naturally down the agenda, but it has not dropped off. There are a number of residual concerns there, and there is the abiding concern that it could destabilize what at the moment is a trajectory towards growth which is holding. So I'll leave it there, Benjamin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I think this is a necessary dimension and perspective to add, the one from Arab and GCC countries, and Iran especially, because I mean we talk about obviously the relationship of Afghanistan with Pakistan that Antonio will talk to us in a minute, but we cannot forget that Afghanistan shares a long border with Iran. And I think it's very interesting the practical constraints that you underlined in terms of the regulatory framework and the sanctions that impede a reapproachment or an establishing ties with the Taliban. I'll turn to Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is an independent researcher and the author of several articles and papers on Afghanistan, as well as 7 books, including Politics and Society in Afghanistan, 1978-1992, The Army of Afghanistan, The Islamic State in Khorasan, and Taliban at War. Dr. Giustozzi's upcoming book is Jihadism for Bloomsbury. He's currently a senior research fellow at RUSI, as I mentioned earlier. And on a personal note, he also wrote what was an influential book for me during my PhD studies, Empires of Mud, which is about warlordism in Afghanistan. Following what others said, can you talk about the dimensions from Pakistan and and the implications of the Taliban takeover are for? Thank you.
Thank you. So the relation of the Emirate with Pakistan, of course, is a complex topic. There's a lot of history, Taliban history, but also Afghan history that comes into play. But I think we have to, first of all, try to see or view the situation from the point of view of Pakistan. Much has been said about the fast deterioration of the relations between the Emirate and Pakistan. and that is seen by many as a kind of revenge of history for Pakistan's support for the Taliban throughout the last 20 years or so. But I think from Pakistan's point of view, the current situation, however critical, is still much better than what they were facing around 2007 to 2010, when not only, of course, there's a much worse security situation inside the country, where TTP at that point really was at the peak of its power and influence. It controlled largely tribal areas and also portions of the settled areas along the Pashtun belt. And there were a range of other jihadist groups active in Pakistan already for years, in a couple of cases coming close possibly to assassinate President Dictator Musharraf. But there was worrying dimension for that. I do think the Pakistani really believed, and then you can disagree with them, but they really believed that at the point Afghanistan was a conduit for support coming from India for groups opposed to the Pakistani state, in particular the TTP, but also the Baluchi nationalists. And it's clear that something was happening because the Baluchis had bases in Afghanistan. They were operating across the border. They're not very impactful, if you like, but there was some kind of something going on. And then the TTP, of course, especially in later years, moved into Afghanistan. The Afghan authorities for sure tolerated that and allowed them to operate from their territory, carrying out raids into Pakistan. Then, of course, you can discuss where the money was coming from, how much money, how many weapons, how much ammunition. But anyway, even if you don't agree, the point is that Pakistanis believed that was a very strategic liability for them, because, and I think in this sense, they have a point in that if the TTP and others were going to constitute a very serious threat to the Pakistani state, that was only if external aid was flowing to them, which is the same as Dawood just said about the current insurgency inside Afghanistan. It can be a nuisance, but to be a strategic threat, you need external support. The same applies to Pakistan. So from that perspective, they think at least, this Indian threat, whether it's real or imagined, is no longer there. And however, the situation is worsening, and the TTP is again establishing control over parts of the tribal area, especially in Balochistan, is still very far from reaching the stage where it was at the time, 2007, 2010. So this is important. Having said that, I think the Pakistanis didn't expect the relations with the Emirate to deteriorate this fast. And I think the reason for this deterioration, the reason for the crisis, of course, there are multiple reasons, but I think the key reason is actually infighting or power struggles within the Emirate. Because I think the key turning point, and certainly you get this impression in talking to Taliban, especially from the south, the key turning point was the head of the IISS visited Kabul and trying to mediate between different Taliban factions, and that led actually to the formation of the first cabinet, in September. That was seen as ingerence of the Pakistanis taking sides, and the perception in the South, which I'm not sure was right, but anyway, this is the perception they have, is that the ISI basically supported the Afghans and tried to put pressure on the rest of the Taliban to give the Afghans, not perhaps a lion's share of the cabinet, but quite a large share of it. Now, in reality, what the Afghans got is about a fair share relative to their weight and power within the Taliban. They're not the dominant players. The Kandaharis are still the dominant players within the Taliban. And we've seen this in recent months with the issue of girls' education. This is not Afghani policy. This is Southern Kandahari policy. But centered is a resentment. There was a resentment. And there was a sense that as the power struggles intensified, if any of the faction within the Taliban, the Afghanis or any other faction, was able to mobilize external support in terms of funding, pressure, whatever, that could be decisive in resolving the confrontation. That could result in the Afghans becoming really the dominant group within the Taliban, which the Kandahari Taliban, or the majority of them, definitely didn't want. So I think the clashes that on the border started for local reasons. Many Afghans have a relation with the smugglers across the border. When the border guards, whether they're Iranian, Turkmen, or Pakistanis, kill or arrest or detain or beat or torture cross-border smugglers. The Taliban border guards tend to sympathize because these are probably their brothers or their cousins or their fellow tribesmen, and they take their side, and that led to clashes, violent clash on the border. But then, contrary to what happened on the Iranian border, on the Turkish border, factions within the Taliban started, encouraging or supporting, jump on these clashes on the Pakistani border. And that became a much more political, diplomatic issue. It became an open issue. And of course, at the same time, the TTP remained operational, in fact, intensified its operations and attempts to mediate something between the TTP and Islamabad collapse, making things even worse, because there was an expectation, certainly on the Pakistani side, that the Taliban would help sorting it out. But in fact, the Taliban were seen as not doing enough, not putting enough pressure on the TTP to come to some kind of understanding with Islamabad. And from then on, so basically from December onwards, things got worse and worse. The Pakistanis were resentful because the Taliban were not doing enough. The Taliban were resentful because the fact the Pakistanis were interfering and they were not willing to give the TTP their due. And things got worse and worse. The border clashing got worse and worse. The rhetoric got worse and worse. And the TTP started receiving actually direct support now from elements of the Taliban, weapons, etc. And so it basically is a spiral of, when you have this kind of controversy, of a spiral of violence, spiral of retaliation against retaliations, and it gets worse and worse. And of course, it can get out of control. And it did get out of control. Having said that, of course, now negotiations between Islamabad and TTP have resumed. There is some progress, although it's far too early to say where that ends. But I think it's still there's still a perception that this situation with the Taliban could be mended. And in particular, I think an important development has been that the Afghanis have clearly signaled that they don't need and they don't depend from Pakistani support. And they actually have taken side against Pakistan. They are aligned quite openly with the TTP in recent weeks after the Pakistani airstrikes, which of course were very unpopular also among Afghans, among the constituencies of the Afghanis, because the main strike was in Khost, which is a province where the Afghanis have their bases and where they're traditionally roots. So I think that it potentially becoming less of an issue, even in the eyes of the Kandahari Taliban, because if they perceive or they get convinced that this axis, Afghani-Pakistan, is broken, then the relationship with Pakistan is easy to sort out. They don't need anymore to kind of sabotage the Afghanis by making any relationship with Pakistan totally unacceptable or in terms of image too costly to have. So that might be, we have to see how this develops, because things can change again. They change to some extent, but could change again. There could be other signals that the Pakistan are again trying to interfere. So I'm not sure whether the Pakistanis are totally now alien from interfering on internal Emirate matters. But I think this is a general trend with the Taliban. I will stop here on the issue of Pakistan. Is that I think perhaps subconsciously, more than consciously, they are aware of their weakness and internal divisions. And I think they understand that allowing any kind of external interference could destroy the Emirate very quickly. Because, like in the past, actually, different countries have different constituencies. The money often was not going, the money that Dawood mentioned, often was not going to the coffers of the Taliban, to the Finance Commission, was going to specific factions, specific individuals. The Iranians were supporting mostly Western Taliban or Southwestern Taliban, for example, and they still have regulations. So if the Iranians actually, the main controversial point between the Iranians and the Taliban is this, that the Iranians insist, we want our guys, our friends within the Taliban and outside the Taliban to be appointed in position of power. We want our guys we trained to fight, they actually won the war for you, giving them ministerial posts, promote them. And also the guys who are not with you, but they're our friends, and you promised you would give them positions of power, do it. Otherwise, you won't have good relation with that. And that is very much resented by the Taliban. But I think it's not only resentment, it's also the perception that you start bowing to this kind of pressure, the Taliban, the Emirate disintegrates.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for mapping these complicated ties and relationships between the two countries and underlining how fragmented state actors are from the Taliban side, which complicates issues even further. Let me turn last but not least to Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, as I mentioned, a senior fellow for South Asia at the Institute. He's on India's foreign security and defense policies and the international relations of South Asia. He organizes and leads the IISS twice yearly Track 15 meetings in person and hybrid on Afghanistan and regional security, involving senior officials and experts from India, Pakistan, and the Taliban Haqqani regime in Afghanistan. He has written and published on India's policy towards Afghanistan. Rahul, given your expertise and your role, your convening role at the moment, what is your take on the international relations of South Asia, and specifically what is India's perspective?
Thank you, Benjamin. I'd like to focus my remarks on the role and policy of India, Afghanistan's near neighbor, towards the Taliban Haqqani regime. And I have sort of 5 points to make. The first point is that the Taliban Haqqani takeover of Afghanistan represents a huge loss of power, influence, and presence for India in Afghanistan. India had been a major development partner in Afghanistan with decades of investment in infrastructure and capacity building and resultant soft power. Although India was in fact the first country to sign a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan, India's defense supplies to the Afghan security forces remained minimal throughout the period. Within days of the Taliban takeover, India closed its embassy in Kabul. It had shut its 4 consulates earlier and evacuated its diplomatic staff. But several hundred civilians, including Afghan Hindus and Sikhs and others who had worked with India, are yet to be evacuated from Afghanistan. My second point is that India, unlike other countries, had not previously engaged with the Taliban Haqqani regime in any significant way. The Taliban's facilitation of a hijacked Indian Airlines flight in Kandahar over 20 years ago is still deeply etched in India's public memory. The Haqqani network carried out the deadliest attack against the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2008 and other attacks targeting in the Indian consulates in other parts of Afghanistan, killing in Kabul Indian diplomats as well. The Indian security establishment considers the Haqqanis to be closely linked to Pakistan's intelligence services, as well as anti-India jihadi groups present in Afghanistan, including the Pakistani-dominated Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. This brings me to my third point, and that is that, in effect, India has 2 major security concerns in relation to the Taliban Haqqani regime in Afghanistan: terrorism and radicalization. In terms of terrorism, the Indian security establishment feels that Afghanistan could be used as a staging post for terror attacks on its interests, especially by the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Although we have seen in the last few weeks equipment and arms used by US forces in Afghanistan moving to Kashmir, there does not appear yet to have been any movement of terror cadres from Afghanistan into Kashmir. There is, in this respect, a certain amount of confidence that India has in relation to the large presence of India security forces in Kashmir to ensure that this could be countered. But a greater concern is over the spread of radicalization from Afghanistan to India through the increased radicalization of Kashmiri youth, exacerbated by local tensions in Kashmir as well as in other parts of India. And we now look at the third aspect of this, and that is India's support to Afghanistan. And we see that in the last several months, since the 15th of August, notwithstanding India's concern over terrorism and extremism emanating from Afghanistan, it has continued to support the people of Afghanistan. India's Modi government continues to provide humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan. This has included several consignments of medical supplies and winter clothing, 50,000 metric tons of wheat to Afghanistan, importantly sent by road through Pakistan to meet the food shortages in the country that you referred to at the start of this webinar, an allocation of tens of millions of dollars for support to Afghanistan in India's annual budget. However, in a short-sighted manner, India has also revoked on security grounds all visas for Afghan nationals, making it impossible for Afghan students studying in India who have been visiting Afghanistan before 15th August to return to India for their studies, and of course, other travel from Afghanistan to India. And my fourth and penultimate point is that while India continues to provide humanitarian support to the people of Afghanistan, it has also sought to stabilize Afghanistan through evolving a regional consensus, but with little success. Last November, for example, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval hosted a regional dialogue on Afghanistan involving his counterparts from Russia, Iran, and the Central Asian states. But neither China nor Pakistan participated, and the Taliban Haqqani representatives were not invited. My fifth and final point is in terms of India's prospective engagement with the Taliban Haqqani regime. Along with the international community, India has not recognized the Taliban Haqqani regime as it seeks, like others, the formation of a truly inclusive government and the provision of women's and girls' rights by the government, by the regime in Afghanistan. But I would argue that India needs to engage continuously with the Taliban Haqqani regime if it is to seek to influence its actions. It is understandable that New Delhi will seek clarity on the intentions and practices of the Afghan regime towards India amidst Pakistan's determined effort to counter India's outreach to the Taliban Haqqani regime. And the Taliban leadership has made conciliatory statements towards India, including a desire for friendly cultural and economic relations with India, and hope that India would continue to carry on its development work in Afghanistan. But the Haqqani group, in contrast, has taken a tougher approach towards India. And India will clearly also continue to monitor how the Taliban leadership statements are actually implemented on the ground. So my closing point is that India needs to engage with the Taliban Haqqani regime, not only to build on the existing ad hoc sporadic contact that it has in terms of the provision of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, but also importantly to test the Taliban Haqqani regime's intentions and practice towards India. To do this, I think India, as a next step, ought to reopen its Afghan embassy in Doha, like many countries have done, and appoint an acting envoy to the diplomatic mission. Beginning a structured engagement with the Taliban Haqqani regime, I believe, should be India's logical next step to help support and influence the decisions of the Taliban Haqqani regime in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahul, for laying the relations with India and the concerns from India side. So I'll go back now to each one of you, and I have an extra question for you. And also, I'm conscious about time, so I'll ask you to sort of be brief, so we can allow also time for Q&A. And I also invite our audience to write their question or comments. Let me go back to Dawood, because we heard now the perspectives from India, from Pakistan, and from the Middle East. Interesting to hear about how the Taliban are shaping their relations with other governments in the region. Are they seeking recognition, reapproachment? What's their position there? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, since the Taliban take over, out of the 6 neighboring countries, 5, namely Pakistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and China, have good relations with the Taliban government in Afghanistan. They kept their embassies in Afghanistan open during the Taliban takeover of Kabul. There were other countries, of course, that didn't close their embassies, such as Russia and Qatar. So out of the 6, only 1 neighboring country, Tajikistan, has remained critical of the Taliban and doesn't have diplomatic relations with the Taliban government. Tajikistan is also reportedly hosting some of the leaders of the armed resistance. And as Rahul mentioned, India is a major regional player, has also kept a distance, but there are signs, as he hinted, that India is willing to engage with certain Taliban officials. The Taliban expected that at least those regional countries with whom they had friendly relations would recognize their government within weeks, if not days. But it didn't happen. So far, none of these countries have recognized the Taliban government. In fact, no country in the world has recognized the Taliban government so far. These countries want to see more clarity and consistency in the Taliban policies before recognition, especially when it comes to certain issues important to them, which include counterterrorism, inclusive government, and the issue of human rights. On the other hand, many regional countries, including Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Qatar, have accepted diplomats appointed by the Taliban government. So Taliban sent diplomats from Afghanistan, and they accredited them in their capitals. And it is expected that more countries will do so in the near future without formal recognition. And in the meantime, foreign ministers and special envoys from various countries have been visiting Kabul over the past few months. Chinese foreign minister, Iranian, Pakistani, and Uzbekistan foreign ministers visited Kabul. So there has been this diplomatic outreach and engagement, but the countries are not sure about the Taliban policies towards them and their internal policies. The Taliban want to have good relations with the outside world. They've been repeatedly saying that we want good relations with regional countries and the countries outside the region for mainly 2 reasons. They hope that close political and economic relations will bring foreign investment and increase regional trade via Afghanistan, thus bringing their newly formed government that the much needed cash in revenues. And the second reason is the Taliban want to neutralize any threat to their rule in Afghanistan emanating from the region. So as opposed to the 1990s, when India, Russia, and Iran supported the anti-Taliban factions in Afghanistan, the Taliban don't want any regional player this time to provide military and financial support to Afghans opposing their regime in Kabul. So for that reason, they want to have good relations with these regional countries, and they are assuring them that we wouldn't allow anyone to pose a threat to your security. But in recent months, tensions have emerged between the Taliban government and several so-called friendly countries, including Pakistan, Iran, and Uzbekistan. There were armed incidents with the border forces of at least 3 countries, Iran, Pakistan, and Turkmenistan. But as Antonio mentioned earlier, there were local issues, but they had an impact on the general relations between the 2 sides. In mid-April, Pakistan even carried out airstrikes over eastern Afghanistan, killing dozens of people, including children. Pakistan said it was targeting Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, or TTP militants, but the Taliban said civilians were killed. Meanwhile, cross-border attacks targeting neighboring countries of Afghanistan is ISKP's new trend of attacks. It's very unusual. The group claimed on the 18th of April that it fired 10 rockets into Uzbekistan. ISKP even released a video of that, but both Uzbekistan and the Taliban government in Afghanistan rejected ISKP's claim. But 3 weeks later, on the 7th of May, ISKP claimed second cross-border attack strike from the border district of Khwajaghar in northern Takhar province from Afghanistan towards unspecified military targets in Tajikistan. Tajikistan confirmed the attack, saying in a statement that bullets, not rockets, were fired. But both the Taliban officials and these countries have been trying hard to downplay these tensions and play it cool. On the other hand, it seems that these countries do not know how to handle and confront the Taliban regime. And secondly, these countries want to give the Taliban time to come up with a coherent strategy and predictable foreign policy in order to avoid any confusion and misunderstanding in the future. But history tells us that if issues are not handled with care, the conflict in Afghanistan eventually attracted regional and global powers. And this might be repeated in the next few months and years if, as I said, things are not handled with care. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Dawood. Let me go back now to Kate and Antonio on the whole issue of state building. So what is your take on the legacy from the 20 years of state building in the various domains that you, Kate, underlined, and what is the way forward? Let me first go to Antonio to get his views, and then to you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll first say something about the way forward. I think the Taliban, of course, they developed for 20 years as an insurgent movement, and not only an insurgent movement, but one that made virtue out of necessity in terms of turning their fragmentation, if you like, or internal division or diversity into an asset. So they developed what I call a polycentric structure, an organization based on networks of networks, as has been said by others as well. And that worked very well because it aligned with the segmentary nature of society in Afghanistan, especially in the rural areas. So it allowed the Taliban to really infiltrate society to a large extent and spread around the country from the original turf in the south. But then, of course, that is quite difficult to translate into a model of government. Because, of course, when you're government, you need to produce kind of coherent policies. And as it happened to many others before the Taliban, and it was happening to Ghani in his later years, it happened before to almost everybody who stayed in power long enough in Afghanistan, they all tend to default to the only thing that ever worked in Afghanistan in terms of state building, which is the early monarchy, Abdur Rahman, which is, of course, a very centralized and very ruthless way of running a country. Essentially, Stalin would have appreciated of it. And that's because nothing else has ever worked. And so I think in any political culture, there's always a bias towards whatever ever worked, as opposed to whatever might work. Because, of course, what worked, at least have some guarantees that it can do something, it can at least build something. It's okay for experimenting, but after some failed experiments, everybody tends to drift back or default back to the established political technology that they have at their disposal. So the first thing the Taliban did, puzzled by their own success, by the speed of their capture of power, they started drifting back to the Abdul Rahman textbook, which is already did in the 90s, by the way, so it's not something really new. So essentially, despite having been themselves a very decentralized organization, they started arguing very strongly for centralization, bring all the power to Kabul, and centralization, not only geographic centralization, but also centralization of power at the top of a single organization. So no, the earlier times, which lasted a couple of weeks to still negotiate some kind of coalition agreement, collapsed very quickly. Those who were in favor became roughly a minority. Many essentially gave up very quickly, faced with probably unreasonable demands on the other side, the defeated side. But anyway, they didn't really last very long. So now they have a very centralized model, which is not good, of course, for incorporating any opposition force, but also not very good for the Taliban themselves, because they have a lot of regional issues with some of their own internal components, the Uzbek Taliban in the northwest, the Tajik Taliban in the northeast, the southwestern Taliban who are not really well represented, the western Taliban who are not represented at all, the eastern Taliban who are underrepresented. So there are all these regional, factional issues that clearly a centralized government cannot address. And the other limitation is Abdul Rahman, at least, it was clear who was the boss, Abdul Rahman. So the king, and it was kind of legitimate, and essentially strength is the legitimacy by winning one war after the other. He slaughtered almost everybody else, corrupted those who were not slaughtered. That could work, but they don't have a leader now. So in order to reach the stage where there is a new Abdul Rahman, a Taliban, or an Abdul Rahman or the Taliban, these power struggles have to play out. Somebody will have to slaughter the competition within the Taliban and outside the Taliban, but I stress within the Taliban themselves. So we would need a round of post-revolutionary infighting to decide who is really the boss, who has the authority to impose this view over the others. And this is going to be a very bloody business. And of course, the outcome is uncertain. There is also the possibility of the Taliban, especially if the pressure from outside external opposition, like insurgents of various description, increases. Maybe they could come together, faced with the danger of being overthrown, and maybe agree on something different from this ultra-centralized model. And you can see already some experiments going on at the district level where they're trying to bring in the elders, open up the doors of the district administration to the elders, some example of local elections, So I think these are experiments. I think they're still toying with this kind of ideas. To be honest, I don't know how it ends, but I think I see two paths, either the development of a more decentralized system of government, which however is anathema, especially for Pashtuns in Afghanistan, or an attempt, a succession of power struggles to determine who is the boss.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Kate, over to you.
Sure, thank you. I think it's important as far as whether there's been a rupture from the post-2001 trajectory of state building. And I think it's mostly a rupture, and in two critical ways. That the lack of resources, the cutoff from the international financial system means that the state itself and the Taliban's hopes of a viable economic foundation for the state are very, it's in an extremely precarious position, and we could see just the continuation of this humanitarian crisis and becoming even more dire as months go on. So I think a big question for the region then is do we think, or for regional neighbors, do we think that the Taliban regime will be fatally undermined by an economic collapse, or not, or will they be able to survive that? But going a little more into the financial viability of the state, Afghanistan has always been to some degree dependent on foreign aid. And before the Taliban's before their military victory, they were told very clearly that a military takeover would deny them access to billions of dollars in aid. And to the extent that the international community thought that represented leverage over the Taliban, I think that was a mistake. And the Taliban are focused on their project of an Islamic emirate. They're unsophisticated and incompetent on economic management of the state, so they simply don't value the resources the international community can provide. I mean, they also spent 20 years telling their whole movement that the puppet government was accepting aid from the infidels. So are they about to? They're not in any hurry exactly to embrace that support. That means that aid doesn't represent the leverage that we need it to in order to press the Taliban for greater inclusivity in its government, or respect for women's rights, minority rights, and so on, and our security interests. There are other forms of leverage we have, recognition being probably the biggest, but that's right now politically not feasible for the West, I think, and the leverage of non-recognition will remain strong to the extent that the region, is also aligned on that front. So then the Taliban decision on closing secondary schools for girls was a really sharp, negative turning point in the West's willingness to engage. And I think the West will need to see changes in that policy, as well as this week, the decree that women have to cover their faces except the eyes, and that the full face covering is preferred. The really insidious part of that decree is that the enforcement is on, and it criminalizes the males of the family for enforcing it, or for not. If the men of the family do not enforce that, then they're detained, they're warned, and they're detained, and that's just an awful way to kind of try to social engineer these extremely conservative policies that don't really have a foundation in Afghan culture at all. But then actually that's a segue to the other type of rupture there's been. I mean, I think we can't overstate the degree to which the change in women and girls' role in society, that this change of the Taliban are carrying out is a complete rupture from the social and cultural norms that were taking hold over the last 20 years. I mean, again, in rural areas, women were not seeing the social changes that we saw in the cities over the last 2 decades. But nevertheless, there's the women that we've talked to in rural areas would still say that the presence of the foreign presence of the last 2 decades did have an impact on kind of social norms, even in rural areas. So yes, and then I guess to answer your way forward, I mean, I think it's a dire picture for Western engagement and willingness to engage, because we're going to have these red lines, and yet we're between a rock and a hard place, because the consensus seems to be that for now the Taliban are the only, there's no good political alternative to control the country, and that chaos and civil war are probably worse for Afghans as well as the region and international actors. Chaos and civil war are probably worse than Taliban control for the meantime, but it's just uncertain. Going back to my points on the economy, it's very uncertain how long the Taliban will be able to retain that control.
Much, Kate. I'll go back to John, and I will also actually include one of the questions that is being asked by our audience. John, what are some of the lessons holding for the international community on Afghanistan? And there is a question on what the role of the UK government is or can be going forward. Over to you, and I ask you please to be brief. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. On the UK, I don't speak formally for the UK, but we can see there is continuing contact at the diplomatic level. There was a visit by a very senior diplomat to Kabul last October. The agenda is humanitarian and terrorism. The humanitarian issue, which Kate has touched on earlier, is almost outsized in its scale. I mean, it's a degree of seriousness that no responsible international actor can ignore, and the UK is a leading international actor in the field of aid and development. So that's squarely on the agenda. The terrorist agenda remains as it was. It's the concern of that Afghanistan might incubate terrorist organizations in the future, as it has done in the past. And the rise of Islamic movement of Khorasan is deeply concerning. There is a pattern to the emergence and the organization of terrorist organizations in Afghanistan, which we and other international players are keen to break. So that's a topic of conversation with the Taliban. This is a long way from having anything like full diplomatic relations or coordination with the Taliban. But those two agenda items are pressing for us and for others. Secondly, I'm just going to say one thing on the lessons learned, because so much has been said and written on this. Kate was talking earlier about the interruption of the development program by the terrorist program, which I have great sympathy with and saw a great deal of. When I think to the way in which much of the broader development work on part of ISAF and the expanding community was framed, it was framed as addressing the root causes of the principal problem, which was terrorism. And I think the lesson that, well, what we have to reflect on is whether committing ourselves to addressing root causes is actually a sensible thing for an international community to do. It took us inevitably so deeply into the fabric of the nation. Our resources were soon exhausted, despite those figures which Kate gave. The ratios of, if you like, development workers to just Afghans themselves, but also to the scale of the problem, was never anything like what we needed. So for me, the lesson we have to learn on both intervention and reconstruction is, when we talk about trying to address root causes, do we really have the resources and the political stomach to do that? And in a very brutal security environment, when you're facing a threat that we were faced, is it better to settle for just the disabling or the elimination of your adversary's capabilities?
Thank you, John. Yes, this is obviously an element that we have also discussed about, to what extent addressing the root causes of conflict, not only in Afghanistan, but anywhere, is a realistic proposition. And I think this is a key and important point. Rahul, I will go back to you and I will ask you first a question from our audience. You suggested for India to have interaction with the Taliban. Do you suggest that India should recognize the Taliban? And also, I would be curious to hear your reaction to what Kate has mentioned, that what would a collapse of Afghanistan and the Taliban economically mean for the region and maybe for India going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. The short answer to the first question is absolutely not. I'm not suggesting or advocating that India should diplomatically recognize the Taliban. What I'm saying is that there have been sporadic and ad hoc contact between Indian officials and the Taliban regime, but they need to be structured, to be made more, to be formalized in a way in terms of a process that takes place, because unless India is able to be confident and talk to the Taliban regime, it will not be able to engage with it, or in fact to seek some of the sort of the policy changes it would like from the regime. So I'm talking of engagement, definitely not recognition. In terms of Kate's point, I think the economy and the economic situation in Afghanistan would be critical in terms of the impact on a country like India. India has tried to build capacity to provide institutions in Afghanistan. That now is left questionable. But any impact of economic collapse in terms of refugees outflow or other issues will, in one way or another, come closer and closer to India, a near neighbor. So in a short answer, I think, is that yes, India would be very concerned over any prospect of an economic collapse of Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Rahul. I'm conscious about time, and I apologize in advance to our audience who asked a question. I will just pick a few and ask our panelists to reflect on them So I'll start with Kate. There is a question here that asks, retrospectively, can we say that the US-led state-building paradigm was region and ethnic specific with its own serious inherent ramifications? Ignoring rural areas to a large extent, plus focusing militarily and punitive campaigns, mainly on the Pashtun regions, helped the Taliban crucially. Kate, over to you.
Sorry, did you say I didn't get the whole question. The Taliban campaign, with the punitive campaigns against the Taliban.
The punitive campaign from the US-led coalition, mainly on the Pashtun region, the audience member says that helped the Taliban crucially. So can we say that the US-led state-building campaign was very region and ethnic specific?
Yes, I appreciate the question. I think I would have, with more time, I think it's very important to acknowledge the ways in which we got a lot of things wrong in how we executed the war, right? And my observations about this relationship between the state building effort and the war and being somewhat incompatible, they're true from 2005, 2006 forward, but before that, there was a window before the insurgency really got underway. There was a window for perhaps actual post-conflict reconstruction, and I personally think that a lot of the counterterrorism, the execution of our counterterrorism mission in those early years kind of in some ways fueled the insurgency and set the course of the war. I mean, we relied on the friendly proxy forces that were on the ground at the time, that were mostly, of course, mostly Northern Alliance warlords and their militias. They had been in conflict with the Taliban over those previous years. But in a lot of our intelligence failures meant that, we relied on those allies, on the local allies, and they sometimes used us in their own tribal feuds or historical, conflict with the Taliban. They also misidentified some, it led to mistargeting, and it led to targeting failures on our part, and targeting people who were not the Taliban or who were not really. I guess this gets to the decision to decide to target the Taliban along with Al-Qaeda, right? If we had made a fundamentally different decision in the early years of the war to not to go after Al-Qaeda, but not to hunt down Taliban, then there would have been that punitive campaign against Pashtun areas. And I think it's a counterfactual. We'll never know, but if we had chosen a different course to have a political strategy that brought Taliban and more Pashtuns into the state building project and under that tent, then we might have had a different outcome.
For your answer to a not an easy question. Can I ask you a question here on what does inclusivity mean for the Taliban? What does an inclusive government would look like for the Taliban and that is acceptable in the international community?
Well, the Taliban say that their government is inclusive, and they also say that their government represents all the ethnic groups, people from different parts of the country. But they have been criticized by political leaders that their government is not inclusive. I mean, inclusive means inclusivity means different things to different people. Inclusivity is also about sharing power, positions with non-Taliban Afghans. So at the moment, most of the high-ranking officials in the government are or were members of the Taliban. So there are very few non-Taliban Afghans in the government. I'm talking about the high positions, ministries, deputy ministries, and provincial governors, district governors, security chiefs in provinces and districts. So they are nearly all or more than 90% members of the Taliban. So this is one expectation that the Taliban would include non-Taliban Afghans in the government. The second issue is about the structure and system of governance in Afghanistan. So the Taliban have re-established the emirate system, but they are calling their government a caretaker government. So every minister has the word caretaker written against his name, caretaker minister for this or that. So what happens next? I mean, it is not clear for how long this government will stay a caretaker government. And what is the mechanism to form a government? Will people have any say or role in deciding who governs them, or what kind of government model do they want? So these are the questions which are not clear at the moment.
Dawood, we are out of time, but we will take just a few minutes to finish this round. Antonio, to what extent the schism between the Taliban and Haqqani can potentially weaken this group as one entity?
It's not really a schism between Haqqani and Taliban. You know, there are multiple factions that also are quite fluid, you know, and they shift over time. So the Haqqanis are only one, and they're well known to the American public because for many years the Americans considered it as a separate insurgent organization, which actually they never were. And certainly they've had a particularly troublesome relationship with the Kandahari Taliban, a competition of power that came back to many years in the early days of the insurgency. You know, they've never been, they say, adequately represented at the leadership level, although they were doing a lot of fighting. There are many other groups of Taliban who are not happy. I mentioned them before. You know, the Kandahari Taliban are the only ones who are really overrepresented. The Uzbek Taliban, the Tajik Taliban, the Eastern Taliban, some of them aligned with the Haqqanis, some did not, and they don't have a lot of power or influence within the cabinet or within the government apparatus. The Western Taliban are not represented at all. The Southwestern are very unhappy because most of the fighters come from Helmand, but there are very few Helmandis in position of power in the government, not in very senior positions. So it's really multiple factions that are all jockeying for power, and only one of them is really overrepresented. It's Kandahar, is not the Haqqanis. So I think it's not true, you know, what many say that the Haqqanis are in a position of particular power or influence, relatively speaking.
Antonio. Rahul, final question for you. Strategy and the tools India adopted or used in the previous government that aimed to keep the Taliban. Final reflections from you, Rahul. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Essentially, the focus of India in sort of the last 20 years before the 15th of August has been on development, on capacity building, on human resources, infrastructure, the soft power aspect. It had minimal security content in terms of the strategic partnership agreement with the Afghanistan government then, and limited sort of support in terms of arms helicopters to Afghanistan, but there were no Indian military boots on the ground. So the priority for India was not countering the Taliban or the Haqqanis, but to ensure the development of the country, and the security for India's presence was provided by NATO, ISAF, US forces. And that is how India's infrastructure development was able to take place. So I would argue that the focus for India was not on countering the Taliban Haqqani militarily.
Thank you very much, Rahul. John, we're out of time, but I will give you the last word if you have any final comments or final reactions on all of this.
Thank you, Benjamin. My only reflection is a brief one, is that some of the lessons that we have learned in Afghanistan, certainly about coalitions, about their cohesion and their duration, is going to be tested again immediately over Ukraine. And I would hate to suggest another session, but if there were to be one, it would be how do we draw those lessons to the very different theatre of Ukraine, but where international attention is now engaged and so much is at stake.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think this has been a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you to our audience. You'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on our website within the next day or two. And stay tuned for our next conflict briefings, with conflict briefing, which will be on Libya in July. For now, and thank you all very much again.